Downtown Van Wert is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This was a lengthy process that we went through along with Main Street Van Wert, who really championed those efforts. It took years of work to get us there. To get us there, we had to tell our story, which meant we had to do a deep dive into our history. We know that our earliest structures in downtown were built in the 1860s, early 1860s. And so that really starts the beginning of our story as a downtown community. The State Historic Preservation Office then asks us to list an end date for our period of significance. As a community, that's difficult to pick. We're still active and vital, so we had to determine what was our historic story. We know that building owners invested in their properties until about the mid-1960s when a bypass was built on the north side of our community. And there was a very clear definition of when investment stopped in our downtown. So we would say that our period of significance was from the 1860s to the late 1960s. There are two types of structures in our downtown that contribute or don't contribute to our historic district. Contributing buildings are those that are showing historic fabric that was built during the time of significance, 1860s to the late 1960s. Non-contributing buildings are those that have been significantly altered so that original materials aren't showing, or are buildings that maybe were built after that time frame. Main Street Van Wert did a lot of work to compile data on buildings to make a nomination for the National Register. This data included when a building was built, what was there previously, what alterations were made, when those alterations were made, who owned the building when it was built, who owned the building through periods of time, what businesses were there, any photographic evidence of any parts of the building. So basically documenting the buildings in full to be able to submit to the State Historic Preservation Office, who would then review those documents and then ultimately make a nomination to the National Register.
So because of this process that we went through to get the historic designation, we have these federal tax credits available to us by right for a qualifying historic preservation project. We also have state tax credits available to us. That is also for a qualifying project, but those we have to apply through a much more lengthy and involved process. These tax credits, the federal and state combined, could bring approximately 17% of our total project cost.
Applying for state historic tax credits is a complicated process. It first requires that we have documentation of the buildings, so that is drawings. So we had architectural drawings done of the buildings in their current state, and then writing a narrative about each of the spaces, each of the materials that we uncover in the buildings, from the floor to the walls, to the ceilings, to the facade, which is the outside front of the building. This is several rounds back and forth. We first submit those drawings to the State Historic Preservation Office, or otherwise called SHPO. And SHPO then takes those drawings and turns back and issues statements back to us that we have to respond back to. So they're called hold letters. They'll send us a hold letter back. We'll have to revisit either drawings or narratives. And then we'll send those back to SHPO, who will then review again and send us more notes back. This could go on 3 to 4 times before SHPO signs off on the proposals for the buildings. There's another process that we have to pursue with the Ohio Development Services Agency. That is the actual application for the competitive state historic tax credit process. That is a sign-off from SHPO to ODSA that says, hey, they've met their requirements, SHPO's requirements, and that we are eligible to receive those tax credits, which case then we are graded on a scale along with other communities around Ohio that might also be applying for those tax credits. The State Historic Preservation Office is looking for multiple things when they review our drawings. Let's talk interior work first. There are things that are really important towards historic preservation. tin ceilings is one that naturally comes to mind. So anything that has kind of historic character that was done within the period of significance is important. It is important to note that the state does not want us to fake history. So if something is not there, they don't want us to force it to be there or to replace it with something that could have been there. We need to have documented evidence that it was there. The state is really interested in keeping historic wood floors, really interested in keeping historic corridors and stairwells, historic doors, and then windows. Historic wood windows, if they are in repairable form, we will need to keep those. We can put storm windows on the back of the windows to make them efficient, but they need to be repaired and preserved. On the exterior of the building, then, making sure that the buildings are watertight is of course important, but then paying attention to the historic elements of the building. If there's any kind of stonework, masonry, that's important to the building, brickwork. Speaking of brickwork, on some of our buildings we have what is called a parging coat, which is a skim coat of concrete over the front of bricks. We can keep that parging coat, we can remove the parging coat. If we remove the parging coat, there's risk of damaging the building and the brick. So in most cases, if there's a parging coat, we're strongly urged to consider keeping that parging coat. If brick has not been parged, we can't parge over it. So a good example of this is the Oddfellow building on the corner of Main and Washington Street that is partially parged and partially not parged. We can't parge the partially non-parged part, but it's going to be extremely difficult and maybe permanently damaging to the building to remove the existing parging coat on the rest of the building.
We believe this historic preservation process is of value to the project, in part because historic preservation itself is intrinsically valuable to our community. It preserves the story of Van Wert, not only now, but going forward into the future. And we look at this not as a project to make Van Wert a historic community in a narrow sense, but to preserve that history so that we can move forward into a modern era of Van Wert with a vibrant future ahead of it.
Certain tax credits require you to then own properties over a period of time. Some tax credits require that you own the buildings up to 7 years. So as a community, we will maintain ownership of these properties through a period of time to allow the tax credits to do the work that they were designed to do. One of Van Wert County Foundation's core values is stewardship. Being great stewards of the elements and the assets that we have been entrusted with. And so as we embark on this journey as a community, we hope to be great stewards of the legacy and the assets that our forefathers have given us over time. And so that's what I'm excited about this project, is that we're preserving, we're making sure that these buildings and these assets work for our community for future generations. We've pursued a historic project not to necessarily change who we are, but to capture who we've been and to really propel us into the future.